I have spent most of my life studying wealth, and the longer I study it, the less impressed I am by numbers standing alone. A large balance can look powerful and still be fragile. A modest balance can look ordinary and still be anchored to something that survives. That is one of the oldest truths in finance, and it is one of the least respected. People think wealth is mainly about how much you have. In stable periods, that illusion can survive for a long time. In unstable periods, the illusion dies very fast. What matters then is not how impressive your statement looked the month before. What matters is what you actually held. I want to tell you a story that sounds old and foreign until you realize it is not foreign at all. In the early 1920s, in Germany, there were respectable people who had done everything the civilized world told them to do. They saved in the bank, they owned government debt, they trusted pensions, they believed serious institutions were a stronger shield than ordinary dirt, wheat, livestock, or metal. Then the currency began to die. And once the currency began to die, the social rank attached to those assets began dying with it. A banker in Berlin who had spent a lifetime building what looked like a prudent nest egg discovered he could not command enough real goods with it to preserve the life he thought he had already paid for. Meanwhile, a farmer, a man with no polished language, no refined financial training, and none of the cultural prestige attached to urban finance, suddenly found himself holding the only thing the market cared about. Food, same country, same crisis, same calendar, totally different outcome. That contrast has always stayed with me because it reveals something brutal and useful. A currency crisis does not treat all assets equally. It punishes some and elevates others. The separation does not happen according to elegance, education, or conventional respectability. It happens according to usefulness. And usefulness in a monetary breakdown is one of the purest forces in economics. If your money is failing, the question changes. You are no longer asking what looks safe. You are asking what still commands exchange, what still feeds, shelters, protects, transports, heals, or settles trade when confidence in the measuring stick itself is evaporating. That is what this whole subject is really about. Not panic, not conspiracy, not drama for its own sake. It is about understanding which kinds of wealth remain wealth when the unit used to price everything around them begins to crumble. People like to think of currency failure as ancient history or foreign history. That is comforting. Comfort often makes people sloppy. Every fiat currency ever created has eventually been changed, degraded, replaced, reformed, inflated, redenominated, or outright destroyed. Some of those deaths are fast and theatrical. Some are slow and polite. A slow death feels more civilized, but the direction is the same. The dollar itself has lost the overwhelming majority of its purchasing power over the last century. That does not mean America wakes up tomorrow in a wheelbarrow of cash scenario. It means the pattern is not alien to us. We are not outside history. We are inside it. That matters because one of the great mistakes investors make is thinking that because a system has remained relatively orderly in their own lifetime, the structure underneath it must be permanent. Nothing in human finance is permanent except the incentives that reappear when too much debt, too much printing, too much political pressure, and too little discipline begin gathering in the same room. When governments become overextended, when populations refuse pain, when central banks become servants of public debt instead of guardians of real money, then the whole environment changes for savers. And when it changes, the best question is no longer what earns the highest nominal return. The best question becomes what survives the regime change. That is where history becomes so valuable. History is not useful because it repeats in identical costumes. It is useful because it repeats in recognizable logic. Across ancient empires, revolutionary periods, post-war inflations, modern currency collapses, and ugly debt events, the names on the assets keep changing, their nature does not. I have come to believe that 6 categories repeatedly show up on the winning side of monetary failure. Not because they are magical, because they sit closer to real human need, and farther from pure monetary promise. The first is productive land. Not land as a fashionable abstraction. Not barren dirt promoted by some salesman as the next great hedge. Productive land, the kind that grows food, holds water, supports animals, sits on valuable resources, or occupies a position that remains practically useful regardless of what the currency is doing. This distinction matters. In ordinary financial conversation, people often reduce land to a line on a balance sheet, the same way they reduce every other asset to a line on a statement. But productive land is not merely a claim measured in currency. It is a direct position inside physical necessity. People eat through inflation, they eat through default, they eat through redenomination, they eat through government stupidity and central bank arrogance. The medium of exchange can change violently, while the demand for wheat, cattle, fruit, water, and raw materials remains maddeningly stable. That is why land behaves differently when money becomes suspect. In Weimar Germany, the people holding productive farms discovered that their wealth had stopped being theoretical. It was no longer being compared to a paper benchmark. It was being compared to hunger. And hunger is a far more demanding judge than the bond market. The urban saver with marks in a bank was watching numbers lose meaning by the week. The person with land, livestock, grain, or timber was watching bargaining power move in the opposite direction, not because he became morally superior, because the thing he owned sat outside the dying currency and inside the real economy. The same pattern appeared elsewhere. Zimbabwe gave the world another ugly lesson. The people whose lives were denominated entirely in the local currency discovered that those balances could not defend them when prices began sprinting. The people holding cattle, crops, or land had something the market still needed in physical terms. This is why I have always respected productive assets more than abstract promises. A promise depends on a chain of faith. A field depends on rain, labor, fertility, and reality. I prefer reality. That does not mean land is easy. It can be badly located, badly managed, heavily taxed, indebted, or politically exposed. Nothing is immune to bad judgment. But the category itself carries a deep advantage in crisis because it produces value independent of the monetary language being spoken around it. A bushel of corn is still a bushel of corn, even if the government changes the notes, removes zeros, introduces capital controls, or tells citizens that a new stabilization plan will begin Monday morning. That is why I say productive land survives, not because it escapes hardship, because it remains useful. The second category is gold. I know gold attracts strange people and strange conversations. That does not make the metal itself strange. It simply means many people use it to tell dramatic stories. I do not need a dramatic story to respect gold. I only need history. Gold has no earnings. It produces no innovation. It does not manufacture products or train workers or improve society the way a truly excellent business can. I understand all of that. I still respect it in the right context because when official money loses credibility, human beings reach backward before they reach forward. That is a very old habit. They do not invent a new reserve asset from scratch in the middle of a panic. They revert. They look for something recognizable, scarce, portable, divisible, and difficult for the state to manufacture by decree. Gold has served that role for longer than any modern paper ideology has existed. During the French Revolution, paper backed by confiscated land was supposed to sound respectable. The assignats were introduced with logic, explanation, and the usual assurances that sensible administrators love to offer the public. Then more were issued. Then more again. Soon the public understood what the administrators had tried not to admit. The paper was only as strong as the political restraint behind it, and the restraint was vanishing. Those who had converted early into gold preserved their purchasing power far better than those who kept trusting the official language. This is not about worshiping the metal. It is about recognizing its function. Gold is not primarily an engine of growth. It is monetary insurance. Insurance always looks expensive right before you need it, and indispensable once you do. That is exactly why serious people keep the same story appeared across modern crises too. Argentina, Russia, Venezuela, Turkey, different politics, different cultures, different words, same pattern. When confidence in official money begins to tear, people search for escape routes. Some use foreign currency, some use real assets, some use gold. The logic is always the same. They want something that does not rely on the discipline of the institution they no longer trust. That is why central banks themselves keep accumulating gold. I find that endlessly revealing. The public is often told to treat gold as a relic. The institutions managing fiat systems keep holding it in size. People should pay more attention to what systems do than to what their spokesmen say. I do not think gold makes you rich in calm times. That is not its best role. I think it helps keep you solvent when monetary confidence becomes impaired and the public rediscovers that official paper is a political object before it is an economic one. That is a very valuable role. The third category is businesses with pricing power. This is where many people get lost because they think any business is an inflation hedge. It is not. A weak business in an inflationary crisis can be a massacre in slow motion. Costs rise, suppliers squeeze, labor costs rise, the customer becomes fragile, the balance sheet creaks, debt becomes more dangerous, inventory becomes harder to finance. A business with no power over price is not being protected by inflation, it is being hunted by it. What survives is a narrower class of enterprise, companies that sell things people cannot easily stop buying and can reprice quickly enough to keep up with changing conditions. Food ingredients, essential consumer products, fuel distribution, medicines, basic household necessities, certain utilities, critical industrial inputs, infrastructure, like services, things linked to necessity rather than fashion. The line I always draw is simple. Can the company raise price without losing the customer? If the answer is yes, and if the need remains stubborn through stress, then you may have the beginnings of a crisis-worthy business. During Brazil's long inflation nightmare, supermarket chains and consumer businesses that could reprice shelves rapidly preserved themselves far better than fixed. Contract businesses that sold into tomorrow at yesterday's prices. That makes sense. The business that can adjust daily lives in the same time frame as inflation. The business that cannot adjust gets buried under old assumptions. I have always admired pricing power because it is a sign of respect from the market. The customer is effectively telling you, I do not want to pay more, but I will. That is not a small thing. You only get that when the product or service is sufficiently embedded, trusted, necessary, or difficult to substitute. In stable environments, pricing power makes for a beautiful compounding machine. In unstable environments, it often determines who survives. That is why businesses with real moat, like qualities, belong on the short list of assets that can live through monetary ugliness. But be careful. A business can look defensive and still fail if it carries too much debt, depends on fragile financing, or cannot move as fast as the inflation around it. The principle still holds, though. When money dies, the businesses that can translate real necessity into updated prices keep standing longer than the ones selling optionality to customers who suddenly have no room for it. The fourth category is foreign currency claims or foreign-denominated assets. This is the one that offends many national myths because it sounds disloyal. It is not disloyal, it is arithmetic. If your whole life is denominated in the failing unit, then your whole life is trapped inside the failure. If part of your life is denominated outside that unit, then the crisis hits you differently. It may still inconvenience you. It may still frighten you. It will not own all of you. This is one of the clearest divides in modern monetary crises. The wealthy often survive not because they are smarter, but because they got out of the unit before the middle class understood the danger. They hold dollars while their neighbors hold pesos. They hold Swiss francs while their neighbors hold lira. They hold foreign real estate, foreign brokerage assets, foreign cash equivalents, or international businesses, while others keep every meaningful balance trapped at home. That is not necessarily nobility. It is positioning. And positioning matters when the exit doors begin to close. Latin America showed this brutally in the debt crisis years. Families with money outside the local system watched the storm from relative distance. Families whose prudence had all been expressed in local accounts, local bonds, local pension instruments, and local property financed in local terms discovered that responsible behavior inside the wrong unit can still destroy a lifetime of work. This is one reason capital controls are such revealing events. When a government starts restricting the ability of citizens to move money abroad, it is telling you something indirectly. It is admitting that too many people understand the arithmetic and are trying to leave before the room gets hotter. The exits do not get locked because everything is fine. They get locked because too many people are reaching for them. I am not arguing that every household should chase some fantasy of offshore sophistication it does not understand. I am arguing for a much simpler lesson. Do not let every meaningful claim you own be tied to one monetary authority. That is concentration risk in its purest form. If the authority behaves badly, there is nowhere to hide because you placed the whole structure inside one set of political incentives. Taxable brokerage accounts holding foreign assets, international funds, foreign currency cash, or other legally understood diversifications can all play roles depending on the size and sophistication of the household. The principle matters more than the exact implementation. A person with no external denomination has no external shelter. The fifth category is real estate. Now, people hear this and often misunderstand me. They imagine, any overpriced building in any condition, purchased at any leverage in any boom, will save them because real estate always works. That is foolish. Bad real estate is still bad over-leveraged. Real estate is a magnificent way to turn an inflation hedge into a personal disaster. But properly held real estate, especially well-located, useful property with real demand behind it, behaves differently in currency failure because it is an actual thing serving actual human needs. A building still stands when a currency unit is replaced. A rental still houses someone when the language on the banknote changes. A warehouse still stores goods. An apartment still offers shelter. A shop still occupies a location. Its nominal price can become absurdly inflated in local terms. Yes, that is not the point. The point is that when the monetary smoke clears and a new regime, new unit, or new equilibrium appears, the building is still there. The owner of cash came out with numbers that no longer commanded reality. The owner of property came out with a claim on shelter and location that could be repriced in the new world. Weimar taught that, so did post-Soviet Russia. So did multiple Latin American episodes where real estate became one of the only places people could park value in something that still had direct human use. Again, not every property, the right kind of property, the kind with enduring utility, not vanity towers nobody can afford, not speculative emptiness, not debt, drenched fantasy, useful property. This is why I have always said that the phrase real estate is too broad to think with clearly. The adjective real in front of it seduces people into believing that physicality alone is protection. It is not. Usefulness is protection, location is protection, sane financing is protection, human need is protection. Those things together explain why good real estate survives while bad real estate joins the casualty list with everything else. The sixth category is skills. This one is underappreciated because it does not look like an asset in statement form. You cannot always screenshot it. You cannot always point to it with the same vanity people use when they point to an account balance. That makes it more powerful than many visible assets. Not less. A useful skill is portable capital, and portable capital becomes incredibly important when the currency itself becomes untrustworthy. What happens in a true monetary disorder is that the economy does not stop needing work. If anything, practical work becomes more valuable. People still need medical care, electricity, plumbing, repairs, security, food distribution, logistics, engineering, accounting, legal structure, machine work, and all the countless services that make civilization function. The skilled electrician, mechanic, doctor, engineer, welder, builder, operator, technician, farmer, and repairman may suffer through the same national mess as everyone else, but he retains bargaining power because his output can be repriced in real time. The person on a fixed salary inside a collapsing unit often cannot. That difference is decisive in Hungary. Post-war hyperinflation, factory and public wages struggled to keep up even as prices moved, almost beyond imagination. The man who could set a real price job by job, though, had a different relation to the crisis. He was not rich because of a statement. He was rich because he could still command value. That is what makes skill so profound. It cannot be printed. It cannot be inflated away directly. It cannot be haircutted through a banking decree. It can be neglected. Of course, it can decay if ignored. But properly developed, it becomes one of the few assets that travel with you through almost any monetary environment. That is why I never like a family's financial plan if it ignores the productive power of the people inside it. A household that treats skill development as secondary is overlooking one of the only truly crisis-resilient forms of wealth available to almost everyone. When I put these 6 categories together, I do not see a random list. I see a pattern: land, gold, pricing power businesses, foreign denomination, useful real estate, portable skill. They all share something. They sit outside or above the direct authority of the failing currency. That is the key. The losing assets in these episodes are usually the ones most closely tied to the official promise structure: savings accounts in the failing unit, government bonds in the failing unit, fixed pensions in the failing unit, long-term contracts in the failing unit, cash claims on institutions whose own survival depends on the stability of the failing unit. Those are the assets people call safe because they look proper during calm periods. But safety in calm periods and survivability in regime change are not the same thing. That distinction matters so much that I will say it again differently. Many assets are safe only as long as the measuring stick itself is trusted. Once trust in the measuring stick goes, those assets are revealed for what they always were: promises. Sometimes promises are enough. Sometimes they are only paper theater. That is why I do not think the right question is, do I expect hyperinflation next year? That question is too theatrical and too narrow. The better question is, if the monetary regime became meaningfully worse than I expect, would the things I hold resemble the things that history keeps rewarding in those environments, or would they resemble the things that history keeps destroying? That is a much more adult question, and it leads to better decisions. Notice also what I am not saying. I am not saying put every dollar into one dramatic hedge and turn your life into a bunker fantasy. That is foolish. People who go from complacency to apocalypse usually end up making just as many mistakes, only louder ones. The goal is not extremism. The goal is architecture. What belongs in banks for convenience? What belongs in direct short-dated government paper? What belongs in productive enterprise? What belongs in physical assets? What belongs in legal title structures that reduce concentration? What belongs in skill development? What belongs in insurance and emergency reserves? A serious financial life is not built around one prediction. It is built around making sure the failure of any one assumption does not destroy the whole structure. That is what I learned studying history. The winners in monetary crises are not always the people who predicted the exact date. They are the people who held the right kinds of claims on reality. Reality is the anchor. People still eat. They still need homes. They still need repairs. They still trust gold in ways they do not trust a damaged note. They still prefer a claim in a stronger currency to a claim in a failing one. They still pay up for businesses that can reprice necessities. Those are not fashionable truths. They are old truths. Old truths are often the most useful kind. There is another painful point here that I do not want to skip: the assets. Most often destroyed in monetary episodes are not reckless assets. They are respectable assets. That is what makes the subject so emotionally difficult. The saver who kept cash in the bank was being prudent according to the culture. The retiree who held government bonds was being prudent according to the culture. The worker who relied on a pension was being prudent according to the culture. The person who trusted the reputable local bank was being prudent according to the culture. And yet when the regime breaks, culture does not pay the bill. Reality does. That is why serious investors must occasionally think outside the moral language of responsible and irresponsible, and ask the harsher question: what actually survives? Because history does not reward virtue alone. It rewards correct structure. That is an unpleasant lesson, but a useful one. The middle class in many countries has been ruined, not because it behaved outrageously, but because it trusted the wrong safe assets for the wrong era. I never want to underestimate that. If I sound blunt on this point, it is because I think too many people still imagine that a respectable statement is the same thing as durable wealth. It is not. Durable wealth must be able to survive more than one monetary mood. That is why I like productive enterprise so much in stable periods and crisis-resistant categories in unstable ones. They are both doing the same thing at a deeper level. They are tying ownership to reality rather than to a mere accounting promise. A good business converts real demand into real cash flow. Productive land converts soil and labor into food. Useful real estate converts structure and location into shelter. Skill converts human capability into income. Gold converts monetary distrust into exchange value. Foreign denomination converts local regime weakness into distance. These are all bridges to reality. A savings account in a failing unit is not the same kind of bridge. It is a confidence instrument. Confidence instruments work beautifully, right until confidence becomes the question. That is why I believe every family should think in layers. You need convenience money. Of course you do. You need liquidity. You need ordinary banking. You need payment rails. You need routine. But above that routine, you also need resilience. Something outside the single bank, something outside the single currency, something outside the single institutional promise, something that gains value because it is needed, not because it is merely recognized by yesterday's system. And finally, you need to cultivate the one asset. Nobody can freeze with a weekend announcement, your own usefulness. This is the one lesson I wish more people would treat with seriousness early in life. A young person who spends his 20s and 30s becoming deeply useful is not merely improving his career. He is acquiring a form of wealth that will still negotiate on his behalf in bad environments. He may still suffer through national foolishness. He is much less likely to become irrelevant inside it. The man who can fix what breaks is hard to erase. The woman who can organize, diagnose, build, treat, negotiate, teach, or repair is hard to erase. That is wealth, not in the decorative sense, in the surviving sense, and surviving matters, because surviving is what makes later compounding possible. Dead capital does not recover. Broken households do not find the lost years easily. Skills at least give you a bridge. I think people resist this whole conversation because it forces them to admit that so much of what modern finance calls safety is really only stability rented from a functioning system. Once you see that, you cannot look at money the same way again. You begin distinguishing between claims and control, between statements and reality, between nominal wealth and resilient wealth. That is healthy. Not because one should live in fear, because one should live in truth. Truth says the monetary system is a useful servant and a poor idol. Use it, do not worship it. Truth says not every dollar should be asked to do the same job. Some should transact, some should preserve, some should compound, some should hedge, some should train the human being who will still be there when the papers are reprinted. Truth says the assets that survive are almost never random. They survive because human need survives. That is the great constant: food, shelter, repair, protection, trust, exchange. Human need is far older than any currency. That is why assets tied to human need outlast the systems that temporarily price them. If you understand that, you do not need to guess every future crisis perfectly. You simply stop building your entire life on the assumption that the current monetary regime will be more disciplined than history suggests. That is enough to improve your odds dramatically. And in finance, improving your odds is often more important than sounding confident. I have never admired confidence by itself. I admire preparation. Preparation says, I will live in the system, but I will not hand the system every lever over my future. Preparation says, I will hold productive enterprise, but I will also respect crisis architecture. Preparation says, I understand that no official unit deserves my total faith forever. Preparation says, I would rather look slightly old-fashioned than become newly desperate in a modern crisis. That is the mindset I trust. Not because it feels comfortable, because it feels true. And when money starts dying, truth becomes a better companion than comfort very quickly.